The following iMovie presentation will be on the topic of my 2010 doctoral thesis, entitled Framing the Israel-Palestine Conflict in Swedish History School Textbooks. For this, I examined 19 textbook chapters on the conflict and interviewed 13 lower secondary civics teachers. In order to understand how the conflict has been framed in the textbooks, one needs to situate the content of the chapters within the broader power political context and history of the conflict itself. As such, textbook knowledge on the conflict represents a so-called power knowledge problem. And the following political determinants, indicated by the selection of topics and themes in the textbooks, represents the framework for understanding and explaining the history of the conflict. The political historical backdrop to these determinants are the conflict's historical asymmetrical power relations and shifts in power relations, pivotal historical events in Swedish and European history, Sweden's historical relations to the conflict partners, and ideological assumptions and ideas on the conflict partners' roles and identities, which I will return to later. To actually illustrate how the topics and themes are framed by these determinants in the textbooks, I have identified a number of interacting discourses, which are as follows. The discourse on Jewish-Arab connection to the land, the discourse on nation peoples, the discourse on international law, and finally the notion of equal claim to the land, all gain their power as a framework through the exclusion of a critical dimension and research problem. And this is a total lack of orientation with the established scientific debate on the history of the conflict, as well as orientation with such new research as Israeli Jewish identity and how it is constructed, as well as political biblical archaeology. Despite this problem, the textbooks do attempt to present conflicting narratives on the history of the conflict. And this has a lot to do with the historical relationship between Sweden and the different conflict partners since 1948. For example, mention is made of the brutal Israeli occupation and Palestinian terrorist suicide bombing attacks in places like Tel Aviv. Yet still, the 1948 war is referred to as the War of Independence, following the Israeli narrative. At the same time, and reflecting the absence of the scientific debate, the issue of the creation of the Nakba, or expulsion of Palestinians, is reduced to conflicting claims. Given this lack of orientation with the scientific debate in the textbooks, any attempt at neutrality falls victim to ideological assumptions about the identities and historical roles of the conflict parties. Furthermore, it also prevents any critical orientation with the historical roots of the conflict, going back to the late 19th century, and political Zionism. For example, many of the ideological assumptions connected to biblical nationalist discourse are taken for granted in the textbooks and teachers' statements. Supported by the discourses already discussed, and an absence of orientation with the scientific debate, such pivotal events as the Nazi Holocaust and Britain reneging on a promise to two separate peoples take on an explanatory power and further entrench the notion of equal claim to the land in the textbooks and teachers' statement. This idea is entrenched further with the emergence of the Oslo peace process, and thereby the Oslo discourse, which brings together both biblical nationalist discourse and international law. What is required first of all, then, is a stronger orientation with the scientific debate on the conflict's history. This will allow the inclusion of hitherto excluded historical events important to understanding and explaining the root causes of the conflict. At the same time, this will allow teachers and pupils alike to deconstruct such common sense connections as Zionist discourse and international law. Failing to do so will further entrench the notion of equal claim to the land, which is the current framework for textbooks and teachers' knowledge claims. In addition, this will continue to foster the illusion of an open and neutral discussion on the conflict's historical causes, and furthermore, prevent the possibility of an educational discourse for peace.